wealthier than every big airline put together, every airline in America. But virtual reality as well, there's a suggestion that this will really take off. I'm not so sure. I don't think it'll replace tourism, because I think we all have the desire to travel, but I think it will help certainly in promoting tourism as we come out of this pandemic. So another way of adapting, and we've had to for a lot of destinations, is to change the target market. There was an article in one of the tourism journals a few years ago on crisis-resistant tourists and how these type of tourists are much younger, more adventurous, use social media a lot. And those have been the tourists that we've seen sort of stepping out first of all. It's been the baby boomers, my generation, are much more cautious. So if you're targeting baby boomers, sometimes some destinations have had to shift their target markets. And California is a good example. They have a program, obviously targeting domestic because there hasn't been any international travel, called Calling All Californians. And you can see they're targeting millennials. They've got very neat commercials, people wearing masks, focusing on health and safety, but they've really had to pivot and change their target market to cater for those that are traveling. And the problem with domestic tourists as well, like down here in Portugal, we haven't seen many international tourists, but we have seen a lot of Portuguese and Spanish coming on holiday in the Algarve. The problem is they're not spending any money. So a lot of destinations like Malta, Vienna, down here, you have to incentivize them to spend money and give them vouchers or whatever it might be. And I'll come back to that in a minute. In China, they found, and I think we can learn a lot from in terms of recovery, looking at those places like China, where domestic tourism is actually back to the same level it was last year. But a lot of that has been because they've cut their prices. They really have slashed the prices. And I think that to incentivize people, because they're going to be a lot cautious travelers, sometimes we're going to have to, cut price. And of course that's difficult, especially if you're running on half capacity and you're not making any money. But at the moment, it seems to be one of the ways to get back. So as well as adapting, I think the second key strategy to survive during this pandemic, and right from the beginning, has been to keep open lines of communication. The temptation during a crisis is to cut advertising, cut communication. You look at this diagram, it shows that there were, travel advertising was cut 93% during April as a pandemic broke out. And yet often, research tells us that this is often the best time to advertise. We're much more likely to have a share of voice when the pandemic or crisis is over. People will remember us and will much more like to travel with us. And it also sends a message out about, we're still open for business and to all our stakeholders. And yet often the temptation is to cut your spending. And there were some good campaigns, and there still are coming out of the pandemic. We saw Greece have and it was all about tone of message in the beginning as well. Greece saying, till then, stay safe, don't travel, but when you can, we're ready for you. We had Portugal, can't skip hope. We had some fantastic advertising in New Zealand, the one on the left-hand side, but the one was my favorite was With Love from Oz. And if you get the chance, Google that and look at the YouTube video, because it's basically telling us as international travelers that, look, we're not open, but while you're away, Australia, the nature's getting a time to breathe. It's going to be even more beautiful when you come back. And it's a very powerful campaign. We've also seen some destinations like the Faroe Islands go virtual. And again, it was, you could travel around the Faroe Islands on the internet with someone was wearing a camera from the tourism board. And again, that was a way of keeping, and it had a lot of traction through social media. And social media during this pandemic did become more important than ever. And, just one example, this was the campaign of Zermatt in Switzerland, one of my favorite parts of the world. And every night during the lockdown, they projected the image of a country's flag to show solidarity. But it gathered so much media that in the end, they reached 700 million people with this campaign for very, very little outlay. But it was just a clever way to say, hey, we'll be there. We're there for you now. We'll be there for you when you're ready to travel again. And of course, keeping the destination top of mind. The third key strategy, I think, to survive and get through this pandemic is collaboration. And we heard it a lot during the pandemic that we're in this together, and this is where I was actually in Canmore, in Canada during lockdown, most of lockdown. But we really are, you know, the word unprecedented has been used a lot, but there was no roadmap for how to get through this. And, you know, we just, you know, we'd never come across anything like this before, the industry. So the only way to get out is to collaborate and work together. And there were some good examples of companies, and in Canada, they use the term caremongering for people getting together to help each other. One example I used in the book was a couple who ran an accommodation, a bed and breakfast in Spain. And what they did is they said, look, we've got lots of empty rooms. Why don't we offer them to healthcare workers? But instead of that, they also developed a platform, online platform called My Travel Pledge, where accommodation owners all over the world could go on and offer their rooms for free for healthcare frontline workers, either during the pandemic or after. And again, it was a good way of showing solidarity, of showing that we care, and keeping your product or service top of mind for when people are traveling again. And collaboration also, I think, is going to be important as we move forward on a government level. You know, we've heard a lot about travel bubbles. Some have opened up, some have closed. But I think as we move forward and ease out of the pandemic, we're going to see a lot more. Already there's talk of travel bubbles between Singapore and Hong Kong, and we've got New Zealand and Australia and the Asia Pacific. And there's a lot more countries now talking to each other and opening up travel corridors. And yes, it's difficult because sometimes they're opening and then they're closing because of cases. But I think that is a way forward as we allow people to travel between corridors. So it's all about working with each other and collaborating. So what about the future? What are the future might it look like for those in tourism and hospitality? And if you're wondering who those guys are, they're the snow monkeys in Japan. I went there a couple of years ago on semester at sea up near the ski areas, and fascinating. But what is the future going to look like? I think most experts will agree that we're in for a long, slow, bumpy recovery. You know, even if, you know, and there was some good news this week about a vaccine, but it's not, you know, realistically, you know, even this diagram I think is a bit out of date because it says a vaccine will be widely available early 2021. I can't see that. I think it's more likely going to be mid-year, maybe even the end of next year before it's widely available. So before that time, I think it's going to be a slow recovery as we move into what they call this low touch economy, getting used to that and slowly getting through this. And I think, you know, technology for me will define the future. I remember writing about this bionic bar for one of my books about 5 years ago. The Royal Caribbean Cruises introduced a bionic bar that could make like 1,000 cocktails and every day, and you ordered it on your iPad, and it was all cool and trendy. But the idea, it was introduced as a gimmick, but it was so popular with people that it was rolled out onto all the cruise ships. And I think, as I said earlier, I think the use of technology accelerated during this pandemic so much that we're now getting used to. You know, I'm so comfortable now doing these Zoom presentations. The first one I did, it felt really weird. I was like, well, I can't see anybody. They could be making faces at me. I don't, you know, you get used to it. It's just one of those things. And, you know, we've had drones down here patrolling the beaches. We've got, you know, thermal cameras in hotels, and, you know, the track and tracing is only going to go improve. And I've said right from the beginning that before a vaccine, I think what will facilitate international travel will be instant testing, and it is starting to. We're seeing examples of it. For example, I'm hoping to go to Canada in a couple of weeks, and there they've just introduced a pilot program whereby I can volunteer for instant testing, and then I won't have to quarantine for as long, maybe 2 days instead of 14. And I think we're going to see it. I've seen Heathrow experimenting this, and they were talking. I was on a webinar last week in Los Angeles, and the airport there, one of the guys was speaking from the airport, and he was saying that what they're looking at purchasing is a $5 5-minute test. So it'll be amazing when those come in. And so we'll feel, and as a traveler, I think we're going to feel a lot more comfortable as that technology comes through. So I think technology is definitely going to define our future. Having said that, some destinations will recover quicker than others. You know, those that are reliant on large events, I think we'll have to wait a lot longer for curtains to open, and you know, those festivals and events, but also I think business travel, not just because of the pandemic. And I think what we tend to forget sometimes, we're not just dealing with COVID-19, we're now dealing with recession in most parts of the world, and a real severe recession, 5 to 9 times worse than the last one. And because of that, business travel will not be quick to take off. You know, companies are going to say, well, we've got used to, you know, communicating and networking virtually, so let's continue that for a little bit. Business travel will come back because we're social animals and we like to connect, but I think it'll be a lot slower than other sectors. I think also some destinations, and this is just my view, I think some destinations might benefit from a halo effect. What I mean by this is that those destinations that have done a really good job, or perceived to have done a really good job dealing with the crisis, the pandemic, I think might be more attractive to travelers in the short term anyway. I'm talking about destinations like New Zealand, Taiwan, Vietnam. Vietnam was, you know, to me, an amazing case in that they, you know, they're on the border of China. They got 96 million people. They obviously they were very strict with their lockdown, but they've hardly seen any deaths at all. Maybe 1 or 2 during this whole pandemic, and their economy is back running. They're probably one of the only countries in the world that will see an increase in their GDP this year. So those kind of destinations, as I say, their tourism is already up and running domestically, as they are in China. Once the international borders open, I think there may be a halo effect. Tourists will say, well, I want to avoid that country because they're not so good. Where they did a good job, maybe we'll travel there. I think that could be certainly in the short term, what we see as we ease out of this pandemic. I think for some destinations also, it's an opportunity to press the pause button. I mentioned earlier on about over-tourism and problems with you know, places like Venice and Barcelona bursting at the seams. Residents, you know, to me, you have to have happy residents to have happy tourists. And, you know, a lot of residents were complaining in parts of the world about too many tourists. So it might be an opportunity to rethink tourism, to say, well, what do we want to look like as we come out of this pandemic? Whether we'll have the foresight to do that, I don't know. There are, you know, places like Venice are talking about this, not allowing cruise ships back. We will see. I'm not so sure. I think we'll be so desperate for money in many parts of the world that we'll just, yeah, come on in, and we'll have the same problems we had last year, and it won't be long, but we'll see. But certainly I think it is a time, you know, particularly for destinations like Aruba. You know, I'm doing some online teaching at the University of Aruba, and I was down there last year. Lovely, lovely island, but they're so over-dependent on tourism. I think 85–90% of their GDP is dependent on tourism. For destinations like this, the crisis has been a real wake-up call. I think the realization that, wow, we are over-dependent. We rely too much on tourism, and maybe we need to diversify. And, you know, places like Bali are rethinking tourism. You know, maybe we need to go look at other sectors and diversify and be a little bit more resilient. And for some time I've been, you know, working. I do some work on place branding and advertising, and I've been saying that destinations need to move away from tourism branding and tourism advertising to more place branding. So you're attracting people to live, work and play. And I think a good example you have in Ecuador, you know, Cuenca in Ecuador. I went there when I was there last year, and, you know, I think they've done a really good job of attracting, you know, retirees coming in, bring your money in. So it's not just tourism dollars you're dependent on. And we've seen some examples recently, the Canary Islands here, as it says, joining a growing list of destinations, wooing people like me, you know, digital nomads. And those people we're growing in terms of, we're realizing we can actually work anywhere. So why do I want to live here? I want to live there. I'm going to move. And so places like the Canary Islands, the Barbados is another example. They're making it very easy to get a visa. So you can go to Barbados for 3, 6, 9, 12 months and work from home in a beautiful environment. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that as destinations realize we're just too reliant on tourism dollars. We need to diversify and move away. I think also the future, you know, some people are saying, have already asked me the question, well, when are travelers coming back? There's a lot of pent up demand. I'm looking forward to having those same people back. I'm not so sure if that's the case. I think we're travelers have changed. This pandemic has changed all of us individually. And I think it'll change the way we travel. Certainly, we'll be a lot more cautious. You know, studies are already showing that, yeah, half of us will get back in, but we'll get back very carefully. A lot of us we might test the waters first. There is that small percentage, as I say, your crisis resistant tourists that'll jump back in, but they're a small percentage of tourists. I think we're going to have to work very hard as an industry to get travelers back to certainly back to those levels of 2019. I think that's going to take 2 or 3 years. Certainly travelers will prioritize health and safety. I think that's obvious. And, you know, a number of destinations have recognized that and have had seals of approval. You know, in Portugal, for example, we have this clean and safe seal that you can apply for as an accommodation or an attraction and put it on your window, put it on your website to say, hey, we've been approved, we're clean, we're safe, because people want to be convinced that you know, you're going to look after them when they're there. It is their priority, whether it's insurance or whether it's health and safety, hygiene standards. So health and safety were the priority. And I think because of that, we'll see a growth. It was already growing before the pandemic, but health and wellness tourism will increase. This was just in the paper last week about COVID pandemic sparking in-room wellness war at hotels, you know, apps that help you with your exercise or TV, whatever. But I think with that whole health and wellness, because there's a realization, I think, about nature and people of outdoors, that a renewed appreciation perhaps of nature. And of course, travelers will want to avoid crowds naturally. I showed earlier about the ski resorts and the cruise ships, and I think travelers are going to veer away from that. We'll go where there's small pockets, and, you know, that might benefit places like the Galapagos, where, you know, this article was suggesting that destinations like the Galapagos may help restart cruises, small cruise ships where it's less capacity, fewer groups of people, because, you know, and people because of that may pay more for that experience, because they're, you know, already down here we've seen a growth in, you know, private villas, even people chartering their own private jets, but just because they want to avoid the population, mass population. And as I said, I think because of this renewed focus on nature, we might see a push towards more sustainable and ethical travel, which I think is a good thing. I was chatting to a guide just last week in Canada who was seeing an increased number of people, and he's out in the wilderness in Jasper in Alberta, but he was saying there were a number of people coming out of the cities, desperate to get out of the cities and come on his hikes and his guiding tours and really appreciating nature and the outdoors for the first time. And I think that will have a knock-on effect as we move forward. And some people are suggesting, as we come out of this, that it may be the end of cheap travel. I'm not so sure. I think the industry will respond, will bounce back. It's very resilient, maybe in a couple of years. But I think in the short term, you know, maybe we're going to see less of that budget cut price vacation, and prices are going to have to be. And again, that's not a bad thing. You know, when you look at one sector of our industry, the restaurant sector, it's just showed how fragile, this pandemic has showed how fragile that sector is. They run on such tight margins. People are paid such low wages, you know, because of that. And, you know, a large percentage of restaurants, they were saying in New York, 25% of restaurants will never reopen after the pandemic. You know, there'll be such a large fallout. So maybe the industry needs to come back a little bit more resilient, stronger, and because of that, charge a little bit more. And I think we will pay. I've always said travelers will pay more for good quality, for good high service. So it may be the end of cheap travel, as I said. Just to conclude, I think, you know, on the positive side, and as I say, there's been good news this week with the vaccine, and I think the pandemic will fade. There's an author I'm very fond of, historian called Yuval Noah Harari, who's written Sapiens and Homo Deus. You might have seen his books, and he's talked quite a bit during this pandemic, and he says that when we go ahead, you know, a couple of thousand years, historians will look back on this as just a mere bump in the road, and you know, and he's probably right. You know, we'll be looking back maybe in 3 years' time, studying all this and saying, well, are we ready for another crisis? What do we need to do? I think for our industry, though, tourism and hospitality, it's been more than a bump in the road, and I think we need, you know, we're going to have to be nimble and flexible to come out of this. And I think it's important to recognise as well that we're not going back to business as normal. things have changed, as I've said, in a number of ways. And so I think it's really important to recognize that yes, we will get back, we will recover, but it'll be a new normal. And we need to be ready for that, whether we're students or people in the industry. So that's all I have to say. And I'm not doing this to make more money, because I get very little out of these books, as anybody who's written a book knows. But if you were interested to learn more, there is the publisher Goodfellow in the UK have a discount. So if you wanted to buy direct from them, that's the discount code. But I can also make this presentation available to you, and so you can share that, put it on a website, whatever. And that's my email address if you've got any questions that you don't get time to ask today. Other than that, I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much, Simon. This was a great lecture. I cannot imagine a more relevant topic right now for us students in the tourism industry and professionals. And I see a lot of people here connected, not only students. So I'm going to give them maybe, I'm glad to see Franklin and some other professors from our university. I'm also glad that you've seen a little bit of Ecuador,
Yeah.
and a little bit of the research some of our professors have done on the Galapagos Islands, which is very good. So it was very interesting, all your talk about how, I especially like the thing about crisis meaning opportunity in Chinese, because I really believe there is opportunity in crisis, and the adaptability and the collaboration will be absolutely very important for the tourism industry. So thank you very much. I have some questions, but I'm going to open first for questions for our audience, our students. I don't know, Camila, if you have any questions. Are you processing some questions, or if someone's raising their hand? I see you are. Do we have questions, or should I start, Camila?
No, we have one. It's Emilio, and is asking, which market do you...
No, let Emilio ask for himself. Hi, Emilio, how are you?
Morning, everyone.
Well, good morning, Emilio. Can you connect your camera, or are you sleeping?
No, I'm not. I'm sitting down on my desk.
Okay, no, don't worry. Hi, Emilio.
Well, the question was, which market do you think is gonna take more time to recover after the COVID? Maybe we got the vaccination. Which market do you think is gonna take more time, and why?
Well, I think any market that entails, gatherings of people, large gatherings of people. So the events, as I said, the events and festivals market, and there are some. There was a concert in the Northern England just a couple of weeks ago, where the organizers had developed these kind of pods where you could rent one for 12 people. I think at the time you were allowed to socialize with 12 people, and you could order your drinks on a QR code, and a robot would deliver them, and then you could enjoy the festival, and it was innovative, and it was, but I think, we are going to see more of that, but I think that particular sector will take a lot longer. The cruise sector, and I felt the cruise sector was a little bit slow to begin with to adapt. It was one of those sectors I felt that kind of had its head in the sand, that this is going away, don't worry, we'll be fine, keep on running. And because of that, they got such bad media that, yes, there are your diehard cruisers that have already put deposits, and they've already cutting costs ready for or cutting prices. But I think that sector will take a while to come back. And as I mentioned, I think that, business travel will be a lot slower. And again, not just because of the pandemic, because we're moving into recession, that will take a little bit longer. And like if you're targeting baby boomers as well, that's going to take a little bit longer. And I was just chatting to my niece. In England, she'd just been offered a job in a ski resort in Austria for this winter. And last March she was closed down, was locked in a room for like 2 weeks. And I said, you've got to be prepared for doing that again, because I can't see things have changed. Yes, we're seeing resorts saying we're going to operate low capacity and we're doing the right things, we're all going to wear masks. But if the government says close down, you have to close down. And so I think those kind of the resort sector as well will take a little bit longer to recover. But you know, I haven't got a crystal ball. It's difficult to tell. Some of those, like the cruise industry, may adapt and may come a little bit quicker than I anticipate. But I think any sector that involves large gatherings of people, gatherings of lots of people, those are going to be the ones that much slower coming back.
Thank you.
We have Paula Martinez, who is raising her hand. Please, can you open your microphone?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
So you were saying that like it was important right now to promote a little bit more the national tourism, since we have a great responsibility. And I was thinking, what do you think about, because I know that people right now it's willing to have experiences in nature, in such as hiking or mountain biking, and here in Ecuador it's getting more popular, especially with young people. But what impact you think that's going to have here in Ecuador with nature? And what do you think about experiences such as glamping here in Ecuador? Do you think that it will work?
I do, and I didn't mention, and on semester at sea we visited 12 different countries. We started in Germany and went all through Europe and Africa and South America, and Ecuador was my favorite country. And I'm not saying that because I'm speaking right now. My wife, she's downstairs, she'll tell you it's the truth. And we came away thinking, wow, we have to get back. There is so much, talk about opportunity. You know, with the nature, the Galapagos, and you got the city tourism, the beaches, and the Amazon, and you know, and I say I went up to Ingapirca, and it was just beautiful nature and the landscapes, and I think what's come out of this pandemic in a lot of destinations is that people are realizing that wow, we have something special on our own doorstep. You know, there's always that desperation to get away. You know, where you're traveling, and you know, it's kind of bragging points. How many? You know, the average traveler I think has been to 7 different countries, and it's like if you just said you're staying at home last year, 2019, people say, well, yeah, that's a bit boring. You know, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you going to London or Paris or Barcelona? And I think we're seeing more and more tourists, domestic tourists, experiencing what's in their own backyard and saying, well, actually, I'm really enjoying this, and I'm going to come back, and I'll come back next year, or I'll come back a little bit later on this year. And also that you mentioned about young people experiencing the outdoors. Again, this might be the first time that, you know, the millennials have got out on, you know, on a certain hiking trail, or gone out backpacking into the mountains. And again, I'm sure they're having just as good experiences as they would have if they went partying in Barcelona or Ibiza or, you know, New York. And so, and because of the pandemic, because of what we're realizing that we don't want to be in places where there's large populations, I think as we come out of this, we're going to head to more remote nature-based tourism. I was just talking to a group in South Carolina 2 days ago, Nature-Based Tourism Association, and they were saying they've seen record-breaking attendance at the national parks. And while I was living there, you know, the state parks, nobody ever went there. You know, you went to Myrtle Beach, you went to Hilton Head, you went to Charleston. You know, that was for the poor people. You didn't go camping. You know, now everybody's getting in their camper van and they're glamping, as you say. And I think this is a positive impact because, again, I think that as we have more appreciation of nature and what's around us, we're more likely to then think in the future of more sustainable tourism and not lead back into over-tourism. Now, I didn't go to the Galapagos, and you know more than I do, but what I heard was that the Galapagos was almost at a tipping point. I could be completely wrong, but people on the ship, the experts who are, you know, in that area were saying, well, you know, they've got to be careful. You've got to be careful that you just don't open the doors to everybody. And so this might be a little bit of a wake-up call that we need to protect what we have, our nature, because it is an attraction. and how do we do that? And maybe it's a matter of restricting numbers or putting up price or whatever. But yeah, in answer to your question, I think I can't, not just in the short term, I think in the long term, this is a positive thing for, I say, obviously there's no money going into conservation, but I think it's a positive thing in terms of demand for nature-based and wildlife tourism as we move forward.
So you think that it will help promoting conservation, right?
Yes.
Because I'm kind of scared. I mean, people is
Well,
not like.
As I say, in the short term, it hasn't been positive because, and again, this is because conservation people or organizations have become over dependent on tourism. You know, we've got to that point. Well, it's never going to stop. You know, it's gone up every year, 4 to 5%. You know, you've got something like 45 of the 50 least developed countries in the world now who have tourism as their #1 economic engine. Yes, that's good, but it's a very, as this crisis has shown, we're very vulnerable to uncontrollable events, and this won't be the first. And when I say uncontrollable events, you know, we're talking about tsunamis, we're talking about recessions, we're talking about pandemics like this, and I think this maybe a wake-up call that we need to find other ways, you know, conservation, for example, other ways to protect, and that might be where the government steps in. Again, I think governments around the world have realized that, oh, actually, tourism's pretty important to us. You know, I mean, the Americans spent $156 billion traveling last year in 2019. They didn't spend a penny this year, you know, and so there's a lot of places, including down here, that are saying, whoa, where's the Americans? We love them because they're big tippers. You know, we need tourism. We need to, for our economy. And so maybe the governments will step in and protect, in the future, make that industry more resilient, which means putting money into conservation. One of the destinations we visited on semester at sea was Dubrovnik, you know, and there it's a balance, the real tipping point. It'd be interesting to know how they've fared, you know, in terms of conservation during this crisis. But what they were saying there is that we need the tourists. Yes, it's overrun and we've got residents complaining, but the old town is crumbling. It's being destroyed. We need the tourism money to preserve the ruins that the tourists want to see. And so it's a delicate balance, and it's all about managing. You know, tourism to me is about managing tourists. It's managing your destination. It's all very well to attract and bring in tourists, but it's so important to manage it so that, as I mentioned earlier, residents are happy, and it's a delicate balance.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Very interesting. So I see Franklin Velasco has a question. Franklin, so just to give you a heads up, Simon, I believe his PhD is similar of yours. You're both into consumer behavior, and I'm a fan of Franklin. So Franklin, hi, how are you? Welcome.
Hi, Damian. No, it's completely the otherwise. You know, thank you for putting together this wonderful talk by Simon, and thank you, Simon, for sharing your knowledge. Just a quick question, Simon. What are your thoughts in terms of the hotel industry versus Airbnb? Do you think, like, for example, now in these COVID-19 conditions, can the hotels regain the market share lost to Airbnb? It seems to me like the logic behind this argument is that maybe the hotels are more formal, or maybe they can have like this big branding behind them that can help us, you know, just bring these customers that I have lost to Airbnb. I just wanted to hear your thoughts. And thank you, Damian, and everyone for this wonderful talk.
Yeah, it's a good question. And prior to the pandemic, I actually had my last PhD student in South Carolina was looking at Airbnb versus hotels, and she spent 5 years doing that. And one of the things we looked at was, you know, competition between the two, and of course Airbnb was winning out. But just the last half of 2019, you know, an increasing number of destinations were realizing that, well, maybe Airbnb isn't that good for our destination. You know, places like Savannah in Georgia, for example, where the residents had all rented out the residents of the city rented out their places for Airbnb and moved out the city to the extent there were no residents. And so the tourists would come in and say, well, there's no there's no feel to this city. I want to talk to some real people. I don't want to talk to guides and other tourists. And that was the same in Dubrovnik. All the people that lived in the old town have moved out, rented out their properties to Airbnb. So what was happening is an increasing number of destinations were limiting the amount of beds that Airbnb, because in order to manage that balance, in order to become a more attractive destination. It was also the fact that many Airbnb owners weren't paying their taxes, and so they were tightening up on the taxes as well. And what was happening because of that is the price of Airbnb was moving up, and we had a point in many cities in America, you know, some are big cities, I can't remember which ones, but some like Philadelphia, where actually Airbnb was more expensive than the hotels. Then it's not just a matter of price. Then it becomes a matter of, well, consumer preference, and that's where this pandemic becomes interesting. Is, you know, what do the consumers want? Now, what we see, I think in the short term, we've seen hotels suffer because a lot of them weren't quick enough to adapt. They just either closed or said, well, we'll open on a limited numbers, and, you know, didn't change any of the hygiene rules, didn't employ the technology that you need, and for the tourists as they re-emerged, or as I say, adapted their rooms, or encourage health and wellness, etc., etc. So in the short term, I think tourists, especially here in Europe, were more comfortable with Airbnb because they could book their own private villa, come with their own people, drive in the car with their own family or friends, and they felt much more secure. But we're now seeing hotels wake up to oh, actually Airbnb doing okay. Maybe, you know, and I was at the mind at one point, well, maybe the big brands, you know, the Marriotts, the Hiltons, they'll come out quick with safety standards, hygiene standards. They were a little bit slow, I felt, all over the world in doing that, and therefore they didn't position themselves quickly enough. But they are now. So who knows? I really don't know the answer to your question, how it's going to pan out. I'm seeing you know, every day examples of hotels that are adapting and changing. And there was one in South Carolina I just read about, the Montage, who are quite a big group, and what they've done, because they're not having any business travelers, they completely refigured their business rooms, meeting rooms, to be virtual classrooms for children. And they're offering 180 different subjects, all online for kids. And the idea is to encourage families, the parents particularly, to say, well, yeah, we'll go and stay in that hotel because the kids are going to learn. They won't miss anything, you know, from missing school. They're going to go into this virtual environment, which is also fun, it's edutainment. They're adapted, they completely pivoted. But again, it's taken them 6 months. Well, you know, Airbnb were pretty quick to put in certain standards. You know, maybe there should be a day between travelers so that you know, there's no danger of catching coronavirus, la-di-da, la-di-da. So, but who knows how it's going to pan out? You might know more than I, since you know, if you might have more expertise or knowledge, and or anyone else out there have any thoughts?
It's a good research question.
Yeah, it is. No, and I think, you know, it's funny, and I'm sure some of you academics review papers for journals. I do all the time, and it's amazing. As soon as this pandemic struck, everything I was being sent seemed irrelevant. You know, it was like, well, I can't even read this because it's, you know, our industry has been disrupted so much that this research relevant that has been sent to me, and often it wasn't, you know. And so I think as researchers, we're scrambling to catch up and collect data. And I mean, as soon as this book came out, I was already thinking about the next edition because it's so dynamic now. You know, it hasn't been luckily there hasn't been too much change. There was one chapter I read at the end on the future, and when I look at it, luckily it's not out of date yet, but it won't take long, I'm sure. Yes, it's such a dynamic situation. And as I say, I think this industry, we're not going to get back to 2019 levels till, in terms of international travel, this is, I reckon 2023, 24, maybe even later, you know, who knows? So it's going to take, there's a lot of good research to be done.
Thanks, Simon, for that thoughtful response. Thank you, Damian, also for that not well-deserved introduction. Thank you.
No, thank you, Franklin. And when Simon comes back again here to Ecuador, we'll have lunch together, Franklin.
Yeah. What I like is I was saying to someone I did a webinar for an Asian group a few weeks ago in Bangkok, and I said, you know, I just want to be, I'd rather be there. You know, I'm so used to traveling to these places and speaking to people. It's very odd speaking on Zoom. I mean, I just hope they remember, you know, but I didn't mention what I found fascinating there, and maybe you could answer my question. What I found interesting talking to the Asian industry and academics is that the industry is very critical of their governments. You know, the governments have been very strict, you know, in closing down and not allowing tourists in and not allowing them to reopen and start business. And I hadn't felt that in other parts of the world. And what's the feeling in South America? You know, the industry, are they working well with the government in terms of this pandemic, or?
Well, it's a disaster here because
Yeah.
there's no relief fund, there's no new laws or mechanisms that can help us mitigate the crisis. And the economy, the tourism industry, especially the hospitality industry, follows the economic being of the country. So it will have an impact, of course. Of course, it will have an impact. This is like saying, like United States unemployment has something to do with how they handle the coronavirus crisis. Of course, course, it has something to do. But we like to complain a lot. So South American it's also a question for anthropologists, you know. So, but I mean, look at Mexico, look at Brazil, look at Venezuela, even the United States. And I'll give the question back to you. Which region do you think has handled this better and will recover better?
Well, there are a couple of studies. One of them I did quote in the book because it was back in June, July, and there was a more recent one with the Financial Times. But both of them, I think the first one was a US economics group, but both of them had looked at this health-wealth balance, you know, in terms of how well countries are doing, and they actually had a framework, a grid, and said, well, you know, this is countries that are doing well economically, and this is how they've done in terms of the virus and controlling that, and that's why I say, you know, I think Vietnam was number one in terms of how, you know, their economy, and there are some, you know, Taiwan is another example, you know, where I think even at the end of January, Taiwan had closed their ports to the cruise ship, end of January. And remember that, you know, that we were still operating cruises in March in the American businesses and in the Caribbean and stuff. So this was the end of January, and Taiwan closed down very early. Vietnam, New Zealand, you know, and again, people say to me, well, New Zealand can because they're a tiny island, but all these countries were very, very strong leadership. And a lot of women leaders came through during
female leadership. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, there was a lot of strong leadership from females, but I think those countries that had that consistent, strong message, whether it was one way or the other, you know, because you could argue that Sweden has been a success, you know, because their economy is doing okay, and they, you know, the death rate is relatively low. You know, it's whichever way you look at it. I think those countries that have had consistent, strong leadership will come out of this a lot quicker, and already are. You know, where, as I say, you look at, it's unbelievable that China's domestic tourism is at the same level as high level it was last year. Quite remarkable. And so, yeah, it does show the future. There is a future, and I say we'll get back to those numbers in some time. But I don't know. I don't know South America. It's hard to tell. And again, I think, you know, you've got. It depends again. your dependency on tourism in terms of how quick you'll come back. You know, I was speaking to Californian people a couple of weeks ago, and they were very optimistic about the future because they have a very diversified economy, very invested in high tech down there, and you know, it's not all about tourism. And so I think it depends upon how diversified you are as an economy.
Yes, well, the thing is, for the last probably 20 or 30 years, we want to give tourism more importance in the economy.
Yeah.
Right. And less on oil, on petroleum. But right now, well, I guess if you put all your eggs in one basket, there's always a bigger risk. Right.
There is, but I must admit, you know, from my experience with Ecuador, that I did see a lot of opportunity. You know, it's not like there wasn't. You have the bones. It's not like you have, you know, because the trouble is everybody these days can boast, you know, beautiful sunshine and great restaurants and good food and this and that, you know, but Ecuador is, I thought, was a little bit special in terms of the diversity, tourism point of view, the diversity it has to offer, whether it's nature-based or city or you know, history or and the Amazon, you know, to me that there's a lot of potential there. So I don't think it's the wrong thing to invest in tourism. It's just that you need to, you don't want to become over dependent. You need to be resilient.
Absolutely. So we have time for a couple of more questions. If you're okay with that, let's go with Martina. Martina.
Hi, something stuck to me when you said that locals don't really spend as much as foreign tourists. So like, in which ways can we incentivize people to spend more? Like, is there a specific strategy? Is it more cultural? Is it easy to change that?
That's a good question. I think it's a bit of both. I mean, for example, you know, I have a friend here. I'll play golf with him tomorrow, and he runs a local bar down here. And he was saying in July, he said, wow, he said, yesterday, he said, I took 150 euros. He said, the year before, I look back at my statistics, the year before, the same day, I took 1,500 euros. You know, he's taking 10%. Is that right? Yeah, 10%, basically. But he said, my bar was full. And I said, well, how does that work? He said, well, it was full of Spanish and Portuguese. And he said, what they do is they come in the bar, the family, the father will have a beer. The rest of the family might share an ice cream and orange juice, and they'll sit there for 2 hours. He said, you Brits come in and you'll all drink 5 pints of beer in 2 hours and then order a burger and chips and maybe a bottle of wine. You know, and because the Brits aren't there, the international travelers, he said, well, I'm happy to stay open. But he said, because to get the government support to pay half his rent, he has to stay open. But he said, I'm losing money. He said, it's a real dilemma. And it's a challenge, you know, it is a challenge. I've heard that in a lot of, you know, Vietnam was the same when they opened up for domestic tourism. All the hotel owners were saying, well, look, they just want the room for nothing. Unfortunately, like I said earlier on, it is survival right now. And so if you can tick along and maybe incentivize locals to spend a little bit more, understand the culture, understand what they will spend on. Maybe it's not, you know, they don't want the beers, but maybe they'll buy something else, adapting your product, adapting your service. And that's what they've done in certain part, you know, certain hotels have realized that, well, domestic tourists won't come down to our hotel restaurant because they know it's more expensive than the restaurant around the corner. How about if we deliver food to them and take a percentage, or we do pizza delivery for them? We somehow manage to incentivize them. And some governments have taken the initiative. I showed the picture of the Maltese government saying, well, to encourage our locals to spend money, we'll give them €100 voucher per family. They did the same in England. They did the same in Vienna, I think it was. Sicily have cut the travel prices in half, so people. It seems to be in China as well. It's a price thing, and it's. But again, it's one other thing I've been saying right from the beginning of this pandemic is you have to have deep pockets. If you have the resources to be able to do that, then that's fine. But some businesses, especially small businesses, just don't. And then it really is a struggle, and it is a matter of survival and just ticking over until those international borders open. But you just have to be flexible. You have to adapt. And yes, it is cultural differences, and I think domestic tourists can be incentivized. You know, we in South Carolina, when I was there, I actually spent 10 years trying to attract international tourists to South Carolina, because 95% of their tourism is domestic. They all drive down from Ohio, they come in their cars, they pack the cars with food and drink, they don't spend any money. And I said, look, an international tourist spend 5 to 7 times as much when they come to Charleston. You should be putting your money into that. But of course, during this pandemic, now they're saying, well, Simon, you're wrong. You know, our domestic tourism is fine. We're good right now. So again, there's pros and cons of targeting. I think you need a mixture of both in terms of target markets. But I've said earlier on about domestic tourists, one positive outcome might be that they become loyal customers. And I'm sure I've heard that already with the south of England. A lot of British people, because they can't travel abroad, they're going down to Cornwall and Devon, and then they're having an amazing time. I said, right, that's all I'm doing next year. They're rebooking for next year. So, and that's when you start educating them on how to spend more money on providing what they want. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Simon. We have two additional questions from Yanni and Paula. So Yanni is asking that if countries with stricter measures against COVID, like China, will have a faster recovery. I think you already answered a little bit that one, right?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you mean by recovery. If we're talking about tourism sector, and we've seen that already, that they're opening up for domestic tourism in China and in Vietnam and New Zealand, and but again, if you're reliant on Aruba, for example, I mentioned Aruba. Yes, 85% of their GDP is dependent on tourism, but also 80% of their tourists are Americans. So they've got all their eggs in one basket, and guess what? The Americans can't come or are not coming. And so they're really, really struggling. And so, when I was there, I was down there, I think it was 2 years ago now. I said to them, you guys need to diversify. All the young people were leaving because they didn't want to work in the hotel industry. It was poorly paid. I said, first of all, you need to have a little bit more than just targeting the Americans, but you also need to diversify your economy. But going back to the original question, that's what we're seeing so far. That those destinations. Now, when I was involved with this webinar from Bangkok with the Asian countries, the industry were screaming. They weren't just saying, oh yeah, we're happy to, you tell us when we can open, we're fine. They like Damien was saying, they're not getting the support that perhaps we're getting in Canada. I mean, my boys are both in hospitality in Canada, or they were, and they've been furloughed, and they're doing okay. They're not struggling for money because they're being supported by either the companies or the government. But that's not happening, as you're finding, and it's not actually happening down here in Portugal because the governments can't borrow the money. It's not like England where they seem to just be borrowing as much money as they want. So if you're not getting that support from the government, it's a lot tougher. But their industry will recover a little bit quicker. And again, if you can survive to that time when the borders start opening, then I think we'll see those places recover quicker than others.
So these travel corridors, for example, they are important because you have people coming from abroad that can spend more, basically. Because
exactly.
Because you get like a country like China or United States with so many people and it's and so vast, so huge, that it's like there are other countries. It's just a matter of the spending.
Yeah, it is. And one thing that just reminded me of something I didn't mention. In terms of that previous question about recovering quicker. What we're seeing is that those destinations or countries that have dealt with the virus really well, have been quite strict, are actually becoming desirable places to live. we've had quite an uptick in property purchases in Portugal. And you think Europe has been devastated. We're moving into the worst recession ever. But because this place has been perceived as relatively safe, and it is, very few cases. Some neighbours up the road, just across the road here, put their house up for sale last week, sold it in 3 days. We just met another couple who just bought another property. I hear the demand for property, big villas in New Zealand has grown dramatically. So I think, it's not just about tourism. People will say, well, look, I like that. I like the way the government dealt with this pandemic. That's where I'm going to live, and remember, I think in America, there's something like 10,000 people retire every day. They don't all want to stay in their place they've lived in all their lives. A lot of them want to move. And so I think, it won't just be tourism that will recover quicker. People will want to go and live in these places.
Okay, thank you, Simon. One last question that I think it's very relevant, also from Paula. Do you think this crisis will affect hospitality students in the future?
Yes, definitely. And it was ironic that the last big project I did in South Carolina in 2019 was about workforce development. And the reason and it was a government funded project, and we got the funding because we had a critical shortage of labor. We were at that point where, the hospitality industry was going so quickly, and students didn't want to come into the field because it was poorly paid or other reasons. And so we had big issues of, and to me, it was all about educating hospitality students that there is a career path, because there is. I know a lot of hotel managers on, 6-figure salaries, and a lot of people running businesses doing very, very well, or were. And it will come back. So it is a good industry to be in, but students didn't perceive it as such. So we needed to do some work, or I suggested we need to do some work to attract more young people into our industry. But I think also what this pandemic has shown is that maybe we're not teaching the right subjects. Maybe there needs to be more focus on technology. And I've been saying this for some time. I do a lot of talks on trends and consumer behavior, and the last 5 years, it's amazed me how quickly technology has dictated the way our industry has gone. And so in this pandemic has only exacerbated that. So perhaps we should be emphasizing technology, but also I think flexibility. I think employers of the future will be looking for students who can be flexible. Perhaps not, I want to be in HR, I want to be an accountant, or I want to be front of house. They'll be looking for students who can adapt, who could be flexible, who could, I mentioned talking to my niece earlier on about working in Switzerland. I said, you've got to be prepared for change, in Austria. So you've got to be prepared that 1 week you might be sent to another country, or you might have to change your job. And the industry is going to be looking for that. And so it's up to us, I think, as educators to closely monitor this pandemic. And I've always been a big fan of customer service. I've done a lot of customer service training, and I think service is going to become even more important now, as customers are more cautious and looking to be reassured that we care as an industry. And that was sometimes students, the industry would tell us that our students didn't have enough of those soft skills. When I say soft skills, the ability to look someone in the eye, to smile, to reassure them, to have empathy. We weren't teaching that. And so I think it's important as we move forward to recognize these new demands and cater to that. And yeah, there is a future, definitely. The industry will come back, like you've already said. Excuse me, I'm running out of voice. There is opportunity. So we just got to see where that opportunity is and make sure we educate those students in those niches.
Thank you very much, Simon. And on that high note, I think we should. And thank you very much. I'm sorry for having you spent so much time here with us, taking so much time. But it was very, very interesting. And we'll see each other hopefully soon. When are you coming to the Galapagos?
Well, I went part-time in order so that I could travel more, and of course the pandemic has slowed that down. But Ecuador is definitely on my list of places. We all have a bucket list of places to come back to. And I will be doing semester at sea again. And if they come to Ecuador, of course I'll come, and I'll come up and see in Quito. But maybe before that. I mean, who knows? I think maybe the end of next year international travel will be up and running, and we'll see. But I'd love to come in person and meet everybody, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak today.
Oh, absolutely, and we'll do something like this, but on Galapagos Islands, and you can bring your partner, your wife.
Perfect, love to.
Thank you very much, Simon. We're gonna buy your book as well. I think it's very interesting, very relevant. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you, and have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Simon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias.